Is social media making us more polarised, more hateful, more depressed, more insert one of 20 other claims? More than that, is social media undermining democracy itself? Well, lots of people say yes. Many of us look at the field and say, intuitively, it's obviously yes. Well, where's the discussion at? And what's the evidence for the alternative position? Let's have a look. It's taken as read by a lot of us that social media is doing things to our society that are somewhat harmful. And I don't just mean the typical complaints that young people stare at their phones all the time and don't properly communicate on a human level. I mean, they do. Indeed, South Korea has put in roadside crossing strips so that people who are staring at their phones will still know when the light's gone green so that they can cross. Which is kind of wild when you think about it. But more profound than that social media is making us more polarised, that in doing so it is actively undermining our democracies. Maybe it's responsible for the deeply polarised state of the US at the moment, and for all the misinformation that means that people don't even believe in the same facts anymore. There was a recent detailed exchange that explored this theme, with Jonathan Haidt making the case for the prosecution, and then Gideon Lewis Krause responding, if not with the case for the defence, certainly with the case that it's not quite so cut and dried. I thought it would be interesting to cover that exchange here, because it's an important discussion. Haidt is very clear what flipped the switch between a largely positive and beneficial internet to the one that we have today. Because when it all started, it was mostly upside. The early internet of the 1990s, when people were only just starting to get to grips with the idea that maybe this thing wasn't only for nerds, with its chat rooms and message boards and this amazing thing called email. Then the first version of social media arrived. MySpace and Friendster were the early ones that became big for a while and then fell out of favour. But the one that became dominant at their expense, of course, was Facebook, which had become the dominant platform by 2008 with 100 million users, which is only a tiny fraction of where it would end up, of course, roughly 3 billion users today. It's easy to forget the amount of optimism there was for how all of this was going to help democracy and undermine the dictators of the world, because no dictator could control the internet, it was argued. No one could stop people from sharing information. No citizenry could be kept in ignorance by rulers who were trying to control them. In 2011, the Arab Spring happened, largely enabled and made public by the internet. In 2012, Mark Zuckerberg was planning to take Facebook public, and he explained his goals in a letter to the potential investors. Today, our society has reached another tipping point. We live at a moment when the majority of people in the world have access to the internet or mobile phones, the raw tools necessary to start sharing what they're thinking, feeling and doing with whomever they want. We hope to rewire the way people spread and consume information. We think the world's information infrastructure should resemble the social graph, a network built from the bottom up or peer-to-peer, rather than the monolithic top-down structure that has existed to date. Well, you can't say that he failed in the goal of rewiring how people spread and consume information. But the downside came in the obvious first question that those investors would have had to his techno-optimistic vision. Cool, but how does it make money? And the answer to that would emerge. It makes money by using psychological tricks to keep people consuming its content for as long as possible per session, so that they can be exposed to as much advertising as possible. The first thing that happened was that the nature of communications began to change, because people had started by sharing the things that were happening to them with their close friends. But then those friends groups became larger and less close, and people started to get better at putting on performances via their social media feed, managing what is called their personal brand. Rather than deepening friendships in the way that you would by spending time with someone or talking to them one-to-one on the telephone, they started looking to impress others and to present a curated version of themselves. And that, says Jonathan Haidt, set the stage for the big change that came with the introduction of viral posts. In 2010, Twitter introduced the retweet button, which meant that you could show your support for someone else's content for all of your followers to see. Facebook quickly followed suit with a share button that hit the smartphone users in 2012. Like and share became the common call to action. Posts could go viral in a big way, and people who designed their content to do so could end up with a huge voice and a huge following. Life-changing. And the process then followed its own logic. Facebook developed algorithms to try to show users content that were most likely to engage them, most likely to get them to like and share it with their own friends. But the algorithms quickly worked out that, at least with some groups of people, politically engaged people, amongst others, what topped the list for engagement and sharing was emotional content, and particularly outrage at the behaviour or statements of outgroups. This study by Brady et al. In 2017 showed how this worked. Using a large sample of tweets concerning three polarising issues, which were guns, same-sex marriage and climate change, the presence of moral emotional words in messages increased their transmission by approximately 20% per word. By the time we got into 2013, the dynamics had taken a life of their own, with large numbers of people trying to create posts that would go viral and make them internet famous, at least for a few days. Now, if you got it wrong, well, then you could end up being mobbed with hateful pushback, and you could end up internet infamous. Although there was still a few years to pass yet before cancel culture got really focused in, for instance, trying to oust miscreants from their jobs and careers. Jonathan Haidt argues this was how it all went wrong, and he said this new game encouraged dishonesty and mob dynamics. Users were guided not just by their true preferences, but by their past experiences of reward and punishment, and their prediction of how others would react to each new action. One of the engineers at Twitter, who had worked on the retweet button, later revealed that he regretted his contribution because it had made Twitter a nastier place. As he watched Twitter mobs forming through the use of the new tool, he thought to himself, we might have just handed a 4-year-old a loaded weapon. Now that was Chris Wetherell, who talked about his misgivings in this article on BuzzFeed, and it explained copying and pasting made people look at what they shared and think about it at least for a moment. When the retweet button debuted, that friction diminished. Impulse superseded the at least minimal degree of thoughtfulness once baked into sharing. Before the retweet, Twitter was largely a convivial place. After, all hell broke loose and spread. Not only did it become full of outrage, but Haidt suggested that it tended towards outrage over increasingly frivolous incidents, like tweet storms over Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's tax for rich dress, and Melania Trump's dress at a 9/11 memorial event, or Senator Cruz going after Big Bird for tweeting about getting his COVID vaccine. That wouldn't mean much in itself, but Haidt contends that there are 3 important things that are essential to our democracy that this phenomenon is now destroying. The first is social capital, the interconnections between people before the internet found its expressions in all the clubs and societies that led to communities that had a high degree of cohesion and trust. When you have a community with a high degree of trust, you take it as standard that people have good intent, that election processes will be run properly, and so on. The second is strong institutions. People trust their institutions, whether it's the courts, the schools, the hospitals and so on, to be basically competent, to be focused on their essential function. Haidt put it like this: a democracy depends on widely internalised acceptance of the legitimacy of rules, norms and institutions. Blind and irrevocable trust in any particular individual or organisation is never warranted, but when citizens lose trust in elected leaders, health authorities, the courts, the police, universities, and the integrity of elections, then every decision becomes contested. Every election becomes a life and death struggle to save the country from the other side. And the third is shared stories. America's shared story was about the land of opportunity, the commitment to freedom, the ideals of the founding fathers, and all that flowed from them. What defines you as a nation that has a degree of cohesiveness is that shared story, what you agree to venerate and what you collectively agree to reject. When people lose trust in institutions, they lose support for the stories told by those institutions. So take schools, for example. Sure, there's always been aspects of school curricula that provoke controversy with one group or another, but now the polarised agendas reach in ever more, and via social media, parents can be outraged on a daily basis by revelations about what's being taught to someone, somewhere at least, and the fear that maybe it's quietly being taught to their own children as well. And the biggest points of contention are caused because agreement on that shared story has broken down. Was America founded on freedom, or was it founded on slavery? Well, these days it depends who you ask. Now, it's not as though all three of those were in rude health right up till the point when Facebook, Twitter and YouTube came along. As always, the truth is more complex. It was back in 2000, Robert Putnam wrote the bestseller Bowling Alone, where he talked about social capital and identified that it was already collapsing in America and had been for decades. He used a key indicator of the number of clubs and associations that had thrived in previous times but were now declining to a significant degree in recent times. Now, that was too early in the internet's emergence to argue that offline communities of interest were simply all going online. He suggested that a number of factors were in play, including the breakup of traditional American family structure, the growth of the amount of time being spent watching television, so people were all staying indoors rather than going out, a whole range of other structural factors that were coming together. But the filtering of social interactions through a performative online platform has certainly become another rather important factor. And likewise, political polarisation had certainly been on the up before the internet. Haidt observes that the mid-20th century was actually a time of unusually low polarisation in historical terms, which then began to revert back to the mean in the 1970s and the 1980s. But social media upped the stakes. An image of someone fraternising with the enemy could be at the heart of a tweet storm before those involved even knew about it. The left embraced call-out culture and began the frequent practice of forming circular firing squads with major consequences to how much people were ever willing to speak out on any topical issue of concern if there was any doubt. Some argued that social media made it possible for people with relatively little power to hold the powerful to account, and that happened sometimes. The early days of the Me Too movement, for instance. But then that quickly began to go off the rails and became a mechanism for mob judgment and the abandonment of due process. We saw the rise of the habitual trolls at the expense of the good-hearted. This study by Bohr and Peterson found that being online didn't necessarily make more people aggressive, but it allowed a small number of habitually aggressive people to attack a larger set of victims. People who use hostility to gain status and power. Also, it tends to give the most oxygen to the political extremes. So, for instance, as identified by the Hidden Tribe study, which studied 8,000 Americans and found 7 groups with shared beliefs and behaviours. For one of those furthest to the right, devoted conservatives, was just 6% of the population. The one furthest to the left, progressive activists, was just 8%. The progressive activists were by far the most active group on social media, with the devoted conservatives not too far behind. Interestingly, those two groups were the ones who showed the greatest conformity in their moral and political attitudes. The authors of the study speculated that it was because of social media thought policing. Groups provided backlash to any of their own who expressed ideas outside the orthodoxy or who expressed any sort of sympathy for somebody on the other side. It's a system that makes nuanced understanding or any sort of compromise pretty much impossible. Confirmation bias becomes the order of the day. And escalation into stupidity must also be a consistent feature because it's something that is afflicting both extremes, albeit in rather different ways. On the right, it takes the form of conspiracy theories such as QAnon, Pizzagate, the idea that vaccines contain microchips and it's all a plot by the World Economic Forum. On the left, it has taken the form of a rapidly changing orthodoxy of identity politics beliefs that are disconnected from rationality, but divergence from which will be punished as a moral crisis. And since it has most of the institutions in its grip, it has major impacts as school curricula, public health programs, even dictionary definitions get reshaped more or less in real time to fit whatever the new version of the orthodoxy is this week. So all of that is the substance of Jonathan Haidt's case. And he concludes it like this: a democracy cannot survive if its public squares are places where people fear speaking up and where no stable consensus can be reached. Social media's empowerment of the far left, the far right, domestic trolls and foreign agents is creating a system that looks less like democracy and more like rule by the most aggressive. Not only that, he says it's our young people who are suffering the most. A surge in rates of anxiety, depression and self-harm among American teens began suddenly in the early 2010s. The same thing happened to Canadian and British teens at the same time. The cause is not known, but the timing points to social media as a substantial contributor. The surge began just as the large majority of American teens became daily users of the major platforms. All of that is very compelling and persuasive, but as always, we shouldn't just accept a case on face value without seeking the counter-position. That came a couple of months later, courtesy of an article by Gideon Lewis Krauss in the New Yorker magazine. Lewis Krauss drew attention to the ongoing review of the research on related questions curated by Haidt as well as Chris Bale. For all the different questions you could ask about this area generally, there was research that supported the contention that social media was harmful, but also contrary evidence that it wasn't. So how were you to make sense of that? So for instance, he pointed to this. According to one paper, political expressions on social media and online forums were found to A. reinforce the expressor's partisan thought process and B. harden their pre-existing political preferences. But according to another, which used data collected during the 2016 election, over the course of the campaign, we found media use and attitudes remained relatively stable. Our results also showed that Facebook news use was related to modest over time spiral of depolarization. Another study helpfully highlighted the gulf between those two. Our findings indicate that political polarization on social media cannot be conceptualized as a unified phenomenon, as there are significant cross-platform differences. Lewis Krauss spoke to a number of the authors of the various studies and summarized their sentiment like this. I found a combination of broad, visceral unease with the current situation, with the banefulness of harassment and trolling, with the opacity of the platforms, with, well, the widespread presentiment that, of course, social media is in many ways bad, and a contrastive sense that it might not be catastrophically bad in some of the specific ways that many of us have come to take for granted as true. Chris Bale, Haidt's collaborator on that research review, he said this: a lot of the stories out there are just wrong. The political echo chamber has been massively overstated. Maybe it's 3 to 5% of people who are properly in an echo chamber. The research actually showed that most of us are exposed to a wider range of views on social media than we actually are offline. It shouldn't be a great surprise, though, if it's the politically aggressive activists on the fringes of both sides who end up being the ones most likely to inhabit those echo chambers. And the thing is that social media isn't the only place you find them. Studies show that polarisation is worse amongst the older age groups, which would be counterintuitive if you were holding that all social media polarised all people who touch it. The point is, a lot of young people shun political content on social media, while older people can find reinforcement on and offline. So a conservative might give up on left-dominated Twitter, and then they end up watching Fox News instead. The other villain for pulling people down extremist paths, of course, is YouTube, with its algorithm. Steve Bale felt that this was overblown as well. While acknowledging that there's some anecdotal evidence to support the contention, he pointed to a new working paper by Brendan Nyan that found that almost all extremist content on YouTube is either consumed by subscribers to the relevant channel, a sign of actual demand rather than manipulation or preference falsification, or encountered via links from external sites. Part of the problem there is that the study looks specifically at the openly most extreme content, whereas I think YouTube's algorithm plays a part by using a very active memory that says, you liked this, other people who liked this often liked this other thing. Maybe you'll like it too. YouTube's creator channels that have analysed many thousands of channels and videos on how the algorithm deals with them has consistently come up with a view that the algorithm's primary starting point is groups of people with similar behaviours, and only then does it layer on top the actual topics of discussion, which is one reason why, if you're a climate skeptic, you'll get recommendations for videos from skeptics. If you're a climate activist, you'll get ones from campaigners and some of the campaigning scientists. The fact that it's the same issue isn't the point. Unlike Twitter, where a hashtag or a search will show you anyone who's talking about that topic, YouTube is much more of an echo chamber creator by design. The question they were answering, though, in that study was, does it push ordinary people into extremism? Well, not from a standing start, no. It might feed outrage to those already on a political spectrum, but that wasn't the question the research was trying to answer, so they kind of missed some of the point. The paper's author, Brendan Nyan, told Lewis Krauss that the most credible research was way out of line with the hot takes. On extremist content, he said, the people consuming this content are small minorities who have extreme views already. The majority of earlier studies, he said, focused purely on correlation. The expansion of internet access coincides with 15 other trends over time. Separating them is very difficult. It's hard to weigh in on the side of, we don't know, the evidence is weak, because those points are always going to be drowned out in our discourse. The interesting footnote to all of this is we seem to be entering a time when the tide is turning. Oscar Williams Groot made this observation in the business section of the Daily Telegraph this week, noting that investors are turning off and users are tiring of spending their lives online. The latest sign, he said, was that Snapchat has laid off 20% of its workforce after poor results there. But that was just the most recent. Facebook's owner Meta has seen its share price halved since January. Its user numbers, huge as they are, have levelled off and monthly figures have started to dip for the first time. Twitter's share price has only been bolstered by the slightly bizarre Elon Musk takeover extended drama. More than that, when Apple introduced new tools to give its users control over what data was shared with social media, they were enthusiastically embraced. Users are fed up of it all, and the companies have gotten that air of desperation as they try to remain the next big growing thing, not just to settle into a more stable maturity. So, for instance, Instagram recently did a big revamp to try to compete with current growth giant TikTok, only to have its user base rebel against the changes. Facebook tried to create a new kind of cryptocurrency, an attempt that came to an ignominious end, and it's now trying to reinvent social media with the metaverse. It may be that the slightly manic haze cast on our collective brains by social media will come to be seen in the future as a remarkable period of aberration that took hold for a decade and a half, hopefully, before people woke up to the reality of what was being done to them and walked away in droves. No, that's not the most likely thing. More likely it will mature and most of us will just find a way to keep it within a healthier bounds. Part of the process of that comes about when the companies themselves realise the nature of their product. Like alcohol, tobacco, gambling, eating sugar, companies in those markets know that their mission isn't to sell as much product as possible, but instead to sell as much product as possible while keeping the right side of the line that could turn into a big visible social problem. Because for those companies, the cost of being the wrong side of that line is oppressive legislation that will come raining down on them soon after. But social media companies will take some time to realise that they are now in that category. Having believed that their product would be an unalloyed social good, they will have to face the fact that it's more akin to a dangerous drug. The process of evolution of how we relate to social media isn't finished yet, it's a work in progress. But if we were all to conclude we should use a little less of it in the future, that would probably not be a bad first step to reaching a much needed balance. None of this is to get in the way of the fact that it does remain an incredibly powerful tool that can be used for good under the right circumstances. For example, the fact that social media has now provided an evidence trail that makes it possible for independent researchers to solve crimes and to solve geopolitical problems that were previously impossibly out of their reach. I did a video on how that was first exercised in solving the puzzle about why flight MH17 was brought down over Ukraine. And if you come this far, you might want to watch that video next.